Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Every week, we bring you the story of people who are making the world around them better. They do this locally, globally, and digitally. Our particular club, the E-Club of Silicon Valley, is one that is not only online, it is also asynchronous. What that means is that our members can do the meeting anytime between Monday morning and Sunday night. It is supremely flexible. We figure there are loads of people out there who have a heart for service but are insanely busy, and some wildly flexible option would be cool. And if you think that's interesting, you can go to rotary.cool and learn more about our club. We take an interest in these stories that will inspire you to think in different ways about your community, about those who might have added challenges, about those who are seeking ways to give back in all sorts of kind of cool opportunities, and that our focus on education, entrepreneurship, and innovation allows for a lot of latitude in finding really, really interesting ways that people are making a difference. And one of those ways I ran across in a story just recently about the Kelsey. You're going to hear from the founder, or one of the founders, Micaela Connery. She's going to tell you a little bit about its history, and then we're going to start into a conversation about what's happening there and what it means in a place like California to have a housing option like this. As always, if you want to read the full bio, you are welcome to do so. Just pause this recording wherever you found it, our club page, our YouTube page, or our podcast pages, and just give it a full read and then come right back to hear what our speaker has to say. With that, Micaela, welcome to the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Start us off by telling a little bit about the history of the Kelsey and what it is.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. And always excited to share about our work, both here in Silicon Valley and across the country, to advance disability forward housing solutions. The Kelsey is a national organization working at the intersection of affordability, accessibility, and inclusivity to create a disability forward housing future that we believe doing so really just opens the door to better homes and opportunities and experiences for all people. That when we anchor on the overlooked and unmet housing needs of our neighbors with disabilities, we just create better communities for everyone. And our work is a combination of both. We do housing development directly. We do technical assistance and field building to support other people working in disability forward housing. And then we do advocacy and systems change work to create the policy systems and programs that can make what we see in our community developments possible at scale and possible everywhere. And we focus a lot on incredibly beautiful buildings like the one that you can see there, the Kelsey Civic Center in San Francisco or the Kelsey Air Station in San Jose. But that ultimately our work is really about the people and the residents that we serve and the community of people with and without disabilities who eventually call the Kelsey home or call the communities that we support home in their daily lives. We look at our impact really across three key areas: how we build housing, how we advance the field, and how we change policies. So both housing that we create, housing that we assist others to create, or housing that we enable through our advocacy work, and to date have impacted, over 22,000 homes through our work. And then we look at field building. That the Kelsey, I co-founded this organization with my cousin Kelsey, who was a person who lived with multiple significant disabilities. And this work started with the two of us and now is co-led by a team of people with and without disabilities across the country. But that our goal is actually to support others in all areas of Silicon Valley, but all corners of the country to be able to move forward their own disability forward housing endeavors, whether that's as an architect or as an advocate or as a housing developer. And so we invest a lot in supporting other organizations and other individuals to do the work that we do at the Kelsey. It's a really interesting part, and maybe we can chat more about this, is like being in a place like Silicon Valley where intellectual property is like sort of such a sacred and protected thing that many organizations have. We're sort of the opposite, where we're like, success for us is really open sourcing everything that we do and seeing as many people can copy us and duplicate us, and in some cases even take credit for work that's actually success for us. Is the more we can get this in the water and have people doing this work when they feel like it's their own, and way beyond any single organization or single founder founder. And then we, recognize that as we do these developments, and I think this feedback loop that we often say between building communities and changing systems, that's where the policy work comes in, which is to say we are able to bring real teeth and on the ground expertise to our advocacy work because we see as developers that, hey, this financing tool was a make or break for us as we developed the Kelsey Air Station in San Jose. This should be available in every state everywhere. Or, hey, this should be reformed in this way to make it easier for developers to use. And we don't come up with our policy advocacy priorities sort of in a vacuum. We come up with them as we're doing this work in real time and seeing what are the policy changes, the financing tools, the funding infrastructure, the regulatory issues that are needed to support disability forward housing more broadly, and connecting our development work to moving those policies across, whether here in the Bay or as we talked about, we've impacted 11 cities and states so far. And then, we can talk more about it, but we all of our work is supported by a blend of philanthropic, private, and public contributions. And so to date, we've unlocked almost $200 million for disability forward housing since our founding in 2018. So a pretty exciting track record, and all really through the vision that for so long, people with disabilities have been, really relegated to low quality housing or stuck at home with family members when they're ready to move out independently, or segregated off into institutional or hospital or other congregate settings. And that's when the reality, despite having very clear and mandated rights of disabled people to live in the community of their choice. And so the Kelsey often says that our work is in the effort of turning that from a right to a reality. And we've seen that in the 2 housing communities that we have open and operating now, and the thousands of other homes and advocates that we've supported in the work.
Well, I love that you're expanding the options for people for whom it is just more difficult to find traditional housing. So let's kind of start with that space. When you think about the kinds of barriers that people tend to face, if you are someone who is in a wheelchair or might have a learning difference or something like this, that represents kind of that added challenge. What are the kinds of things that they normally encounter when they're looking at apartment options and things like that?
Yeah, I think that it was interesting when I first started this work. I came to it, like I said, as a family member of someone with disabilities, and had also worked in the education space for young people with disabilities. And so there was just a lot of discussion around disability housing and like it being needed. But disability housing is such a big and frankly all-encompassing word in some ways. When we even think of our own housing, like what does that actually mean? And so I spent sort of the first couple of years, even before I started the Kelsey, really deep diving onto what do we mean when we say disability forward housing, or disability housing. Disability forward housing is a term that the Kelsey has sort of adopted since then. But and that started with, to your point, the real barriers that existed out there. And when I had conversations with folks and studied the existing models out there, and this is reinforced by the work that our team is doing now, is what we found is when people were talking about what was needed around housing for people with disabilities, what they actually were often talking about is either one of these 3 things or a combination of all of them, which is, first, it was an issue of affordability, that disabled people were disproportionately low and extremely low income, and therefore priced out of most housing. And especially as housing becomes more and more expensive and more folks are priced out, disabled people were particularly squeezed. And so at some level, we were talking about an affordability gap, that for whether disabled people who were on SSI as their sole source of income, of which millions of Americans are, or disabled people who work in who are working disabled folks who have, minimum wage or part-time work that just couldn't afford housing, or even full-time work that couldn't afford housing, that there was an affordability gap. And that was really a financing piece. And that kind of parallels our broader housing affordability gap in this region and across the country. Though I would note, for people with disabilities who are on SSI, which is the sole source of income for a lot of folks who are permanently disabled, they can't afford housing in any U.S. market. And in California, would have to pay like 230, I don't know what the current number is, but it's around there, 230% of their income to afford an efficiency apartment in California. So the first gap was really the affordability and the pricing. And then the second thing came and around accessibility, which was, okay, well, let's say I can't even afford housing. Then folks would say, but what I can afford or what I find out in the market doesn't meet my physical design needs. Either it's located in a place that isn't near where I need to be near or near transit that I need to have, or my service providers, or even my families and my support system, or it's designed in a way that I can't physically access or thrive in the building. So it doesn't have an elevator, or it doesn't have a space in my building for my supportive service staff, or it doesn't have modifications in my unit for my mobility needs, or it doesn't have the sensory support for me being low vision or hard of hearing, et cetera. And so the second gap was really around accessibility, which we look at affordability as a financing need. Accessibility was really about the built environment. And so that was the second undertaking, is really looking at how do we drive the built environment towards cross disability access, meaning for all types of disabilities, what does design look like? We actually co-created something called the Inclusive Design Standards, which are a set of guidelines that the Kelsey created with Micaela Architecture, that is an open source design guideline to address exactly that, around accessibility in housing. And then the third piece that comes up around the real gap and the need for new programming then is a category we call inclusivity, which is really about how the buildings are operated. And that goes both to um, kind of three different areas. One, the level of segregation, or in our case, not inclusion, of people with disabilities. And so making sure that the options, often people, they could find something they could afford, they could find something accessible. And those only options that met those two things were where they were segregated off from everybody else, and only with other people with disabilities and options super limited. And so inclusivity to us is both an integrated community of people with and without disabilities. Inclusivity also means that is connected to and supportive of whatever services that person might use. So folks using an hour of care a week or 24 hours of care a day, that their housing should allow them to bring in and access those services where they live. And then the third inclusivity piece is really about the culture and the belonging of a community, with a culture of connection and value and interdependence, where people with and without disabilities can really be connected and supported and find a sense of belonging. And so combining all those together, we, finance places to be mixed income affordable. We design them to be cross disability accessible, and then we operate them to be inclusive and interdependent.
Well, there's so many things I want to
Yeah.
dive into, with that. Let's start with just some of the things around costs. Claire asks about the kinds of costs that may be a function of certain kinds of regulations that happen in different spaces. Is it the case that there are lessened regulations for disability forward housing that come as a result of some kind of organized collaboration with the local municipality or anything like that?
So currently, there are some like land use and zoning provisions in different states that support density and bigger housing, and streamlining of housing that just helps like build more housing, period. And those provisions often also can help accessibility. So being able to build being able to, we some of the California state laws that allow ministerial approval of multifamily housing, which allows people to build, larger communities, or gentle density communities where previously they might have only be able to have a single family home or a very small development. It is inherently the case that newer and larger developments are just easier to include accessibility features where they previously weren't included. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the zoning was made to incentivize accessibility. It's just that pro housing zoning inherently supports newer housing and more dense housing, and newer housing and more dense housing is easier to have better accessibility in. So they are connected but not explicit around accessibility. I think we are, though, and we have had conversations with municipalities around exactly this question of what would it look like to put in density bonuses or other incentives for people who go into enhanced accessibility. So we've like particularly put a policy forward to a few municipalities of, what if you created a density bonus where if people said they were going to commit to including an elevator and having increased mobility in their hallway space and other things that would support enhanced mobility, accessibility, that they would get, benefits around total height or FAR or ability to build a larger building because they're committing to those features. We have not had somebody adopt that to date, but that is something that we're actively, thinking about and pushing folks on.
Well, I mean, it makes sense at a level that you can expect certain folks to carry that torch as once they properly understand it and have a connection that makes them feel that that is something to put forward.
Yeah. And the second part of Claire's question sort of around like what I would interpret as an economies of scale question, I do think is a worthwhile one, which is like by having like, grouped housing at some level, do you create economies where it reduces a cost? And I'd say one, we're always very cautious around talking about, that in terms of like sometimes when you look at reduce costs by building higher scale, how you're achieving the cost reductions is because you're taking away people's choice and sort of serving them like in a more uniform way versus giving people individual autonomy. So that's not the direction we want to go. But I do think there is an inherent point that having scale allows you to do things when you're serving, at the Kelsey where we have, in San Jose, we have an 115 home community of which, 25% of our homes are reserved for people with disabilities and another 10 to 15% of our homes have people with disabilities in them, even though we're not reserved. Because of the scale of that community, we can afford to provide dedicated on-site staff members that are inclusion concierge that, we couldn't provide those staff members to four people living in a place, or we can justify having accessible equipment in our gym because we know that there's enough people that are going to utilize that equipment, or we can afford to bring in different service programs because we're going to have more people take advantage of those programs. So I think it is like it was something I studied before I started this work. I published a paper for it's still available if you're really interested in geeking out on this issue, for the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard on housing models for disabilities. And I did actually go and visit a large state-run institution, of which we are not at all trying to recreate institutions in any way, shape, or form, except the one thing that I left an institution thinking about was this economies of scale question, that institutions could offer certain specialized things in a collective setting that, scattered those individuals would never have access to. And so how can we sort of replicate that at some level? That's what we say about, that's frankly what being disability forward is. How can we replicate that disability forwardness of the institutions without having any of the negative parts of the institution, which are, taking away choice and autonomy, segregation, often abuse and other things too. But there is that one piece of being able to be disability forward and doing that at scale in a way that in an integrated multifamily community you can do, because you've had that higher number of folks, but you're serving them still in an integrated setting, still supporting their choice and individualization, and allowing people to not be segregated in order to receive those opportunities.
So, so one of the things that comes up as a function of that is the recognition that there are a range of options. When you say that, there's almost 22,000 homes that have been a part of the network in some way, shape, or form, right? I'm guessing there is this range. What I'd like for you to do is to first describe the Kelsey, like the Kelsey itself here. To real so people have this very clear sense of like what is this space and how does it work like really well for its residents. And then talk about the range. My half brother is in the Arkadelphia Human Development Center in Arkansas. Shout out to the HDC there, and thrives, and it's awesome. And my brother's awesome, and there you go.
Mhm.
But just understanding how that becomes part of the thinking when it comes to like, okay, we want people who have challenges in some way to have options. And those options need to fit a range. And the range, it sounds like the Kelsey is doing quite the job of making sure that there is a range for people.
Yeah. So first, and sort of like, giving you a virtual or a tour of the Kelsey Air Station. That was our first community that opened in San Jose, in the capital of Silicon Valley, as they like to say. So the Kelsey Air Station, I alluded to this, is an 115 home community. It is a mixed income community, meaning it ranges from people who earn all affordable housing is structured by AMI, area median income. And so, on the affordability side, to use our framework, the Kelsey Air Station includes homes from people at 20% of AMI all the way up to 80% of area median income AMI. That's a huge range. So that community includes homes for people who, are, making $18,000 a year up to folks who are making $96,000 a year, which is a real income diversity. And in some cases, even lower than that, lowest end, because folks have in a voucher where there are folks who, are making even less, who are like in like, on SSI and at like, 12 to $14,000 a year in income. So a huge range, and all of those people live in their own individual either studio or two-bedroom apartments in a community. And the community, one of the things that we was our hope and is really cool to see in reality is it's a real mixed community in terms of there are people with disabilities, there are young professionals, there are couples living in their first apartment together, there are older adults, there are families, there are local workers, there are students who are volunteering, and there's just a real mix of a community there, that was the desire, and we see that in the residents. The key sort of design features are one, for us, and to your point of, and I'll talk even more on it, of serving a range of needs. The building was the sort of launch point for the inclusive design standards, and so the building includes cross disability accessibility, and that includes things like individual unit adaptability, dual counter heights, the ability to add grab bars with no cost, or add a door actuator, so like an automatic door opener, for people with mobility needs. It includes features for people with cognitive access, so our cognitive support needs. So there's rooms where folks can have meetings with support staff, whether those are like the Kelsey staff, or if you have your own in-home care provider and you want to meet with your support team, not in your apartment, but use one of our drop-in rooms. The floors are color coded so that if you don't use numbers to navigate in a building, you can know that you're on the yellow rabbit floor, and that's how you'd know it. And you'd know by your color, and your unit has the same kind of symbol and color coding. There's tactile wayfinding, both for cognitive access as well for people who are low vision. There's acoustic features in the common areas and elsewhere to help people orient in the building and have low sensory or different acoustics to help them know where they are. There's a mix of, some indoor and outdoor spaces, so people have access to, natural light and outdoor seating, and an intentional selection of materials for healthy and, low VOC and healthy materials, for people with sensory and health sensitivities. So really thoughtful design that supports a lot of different, what we call impact areas. So a lot of different access needs. It's not just people with mobility, or just people with autism, or just people with health needs. We really thought about how do we create an inclusive and accessible design that really encompasses all of those. The other thing you'll notice in the design of the building is an intentionality about design that supports connection and community. So at the Kelsey Air Station, the first thing you see when you walk in is our inclusion concierge desk, and I'll talk about who they are in a minute. And then you walk into this community lobby where there is a common space for all sorts of folks, and I'll share this picture because I should have done this while I'm talking, to see the building and what it looks like. So you walk in and you see this community lobby, which is normally the area that you kind of can just pass through on your way to the elevator, but it's also over here, a large meeting area where there's a screen and tables that you can rearrange. And so that's where Thanksgiving dinner happens. It's where movie nights or Warriors watch parties happen, or when we bring in a peer health educator to talk about health and wellness, or a financial person to do a workshop on taxes and budgeting. And so the community lobby is just this real active space designed to fit that goal of the community around connection and support and belonging and interdependence, which the community has really achieved. And, we have these staff members who live and work in the community called our inclusion concierge, who help connect residents to each other to the broader community and to the services and support that they need. And they operate, throughout the day and evenings to support our residents in a myriad of ways, and do everything from supporting a resident who's behind on rent, figuring out how they can get new supports to that, helping a resident find a new service provider, helping a resident find a volunteer opportunity in the community, helping a resident deal with a crisis that they're working through, helping a resident work through a medical challenge, helping a resident, deal with a social, emotional, and relationship type thing. So they're really step food security, all of these things. And they do a lot of those direct supports. The other thing that I think is so incredible about the Kelsey is that, to my point of the diversity of the residents who live there, one of our goals when we built the Kelsey was this interdependent community where residents really knew each other and looked out for each other, and built community around connection and belonging across people of incomes and with and without disabilities. But that was sort of a bet. Like, we can't make people build community. We can hopefully set the foundation that makes that really possible. And it's incredible to see, like, almost 2 years into running this community, we've seen that to be the reality where our residents know each other. We have videos on our website of resident stories, and residents, know their neighbors. They speak about the fact that one of the things they like about this community is that visibility and connection. When I'm on site doing different things, and when I like leave at 4 or 5 at the end of the day, there are folks who are all at the end of the day. It's always all of a sudden gathering where residents just naturally come to the lobby, and they're watching a game or doing puzzles or just chatting or catching up, or kids doing homework downstairs. Like, it's this real connected, strong community of people who know and value each other, which was again the bet and the hope, but is really, really cool to see that in reality. The other thing I'll point out, just as it relates to the different options that I think you're spot on, is giving people housing that supports, a diversity of access needs or support needs. Is, I'll note that at the Kelsey, among our residents with disabilities, it is the case that we have some residents who have, minimal support needs with disabilities, who might have somebody come in for an hour a week to help them with, planning and executive functioning and shopping or budgeting. And then we have other residents who live or have 24-hour caregivers supporting them, who have really high support needs, sometimes significant medical needs or behavioral needs, or needs communication support. And they all can live in community-based housing. And so I think that's the real, historically, we've had in disability so much conflation of housing and services, where we have sort of said that you can only live in this type of housing if you have this level of support need, and certain disabilities live in this type of housing. And we've really segregated it out, and also really undermined people's choice about where they could live based on the level of support need that they required. Our co-founder, my cousin Kelsey, was a person with significant support needs who used 24-hour care. And so it's been really important for us at the Kelsey to build housing that is fully inclusive and fully community based, and that doesn't undermine or take away that opportunity from people with high support needs. And I think we've seen that in our buildings. And I think from a policy perspective, that's a change that we can and continue to talk about, of how do we support community-based housing for folks who are across the spectrum of needs. And it's totally possible. It's just a choice of ensuring that you include that community. And it's also something around structural too. It's like having 2-bedroom units is really critical, because that allows folks to live in a unit where they have 24-hour care living in the other bedroom. Having the on-site inclusion concierge allows for that service backstop and service connection for folks with higher needs. Having, a state that has a supportive service infrastructure where people can, afford, and there's not a long wait list to get home and community-based services that they can bring into their home and utilize when they live in a housing community like the Kelsey. So there's some structural pieces that allow this to happen too, but it's also a values piece of deciding that this housing is possible for people of all types of disabilities, not just one.
So the idea of linking values and community is one that for me speaks to this huge advantage that the Kelsey offers. I mean, there's all kinds of people who live in spaces where they feel no particular community to the people in these single family homes next to them, or in the apartments, along the hall, or whatever it might be. And it seems like one of the pieces of the model the Kelsey has is building the kind of community that represents an advantage over any competing housing option. you want to speak a little bit more to that as we kind of wind down the recording time that we have?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting and important reminder about like housing and community, and that word community of communal is like it used to be the case, in so many different structures that where we lived was inherently connected to other people. And I think like, I just finished reading a Jerry Garcia bio that was about like the counterculture in the Bay Area, and like so much of people like who moved to the Bay and like the 60s and 70s were moving into communal communities. Like that was the idea, communes and hippie houses and all of these things where people like by design wanted to live together, wanted to share, wanted to connect, wanted to, lean into one another for different times, wanted to have that feeling of connectivity and shared values. The same goes from our cities, that like New York City was like a place of boarding houses. People like moved into these, shared settings. There's just, and neighbor, could go on and on and on. And so I do think that the Kelsey is representing what is a return to this idea that we don't, all need to live in our, teeny tiny boxes where we don't interact with anybody around us, but that people desire with and without disabilities to live in a place where they're seen, where they're connected, where there's an underlying spirit of interdependence and, mutual concern and belonging. And so that's something that when we did our early focus groups, we heard from our, target residents with disabilities that that was something that they needed at some level. And from anybody can think about that's just something that we want. And so, returning to that idea of more communal, more connected, more interdependence is just, we can learn. I often, one of my favorite advocates, she passed away in the last year, Alice Wong, used to talk about the ways that disabled people were oracles and sages, that they sort of predict and understand things, faster and beyond what the rest of us do. And I think this idea of interdependence and connected community, there's nowhere that that's more true, that disabled people can show us and lead the way on what real, true living in community looks like and means for everybody.
Well, love thy neighbor fits for sure. I think what we will do is we will wind down the recording. Michaela, I will pass it back to you in just a minute. But for all of you who have taken time to watch this video or listen to this podcast, we thank you for taking that moment to listen for a story that might inspire you. We hope you will share the links with others who might be out there wanting to figure out how they can be a part of a better community themselves, how they can be part of improving communities. That opportunity that we all have to make the world better for others is something that we can get joy and meaning out of. And that's something that we believe strongly as a part of the Rotary Club of Silicon Valley. And hope you'll keep coming back because we've got so many of these recordings that we are excited to share from people all over the world. I will I will end by saying that we are hoping that you will take a look not just at rotary.cool, which will get you to our site, but also the Kelsey, KELSEY.org to learn more about the work that Micaela and her team have been doing here and across the country. And as we always like to do, we hand it back to our speaker for the final word. Micaela, what would you like people to have kind of clearly in mind as they finish this recording?
Yeah, I hope that folks learned a little bit about what a disability forward housing future means and what a disability forward housing future can be, and a recognition that all of us can be sort of advocates and innovators around that future, in our local neighborhoods by saying yes to housing, in our local communities by, understanding disability rights and disability support, and across our country and our world around, thinking about the policies and supports that need to happen that we can all be advocates for. So thanks for including us. And yeah, would encourage folks to check out our website. We always love to host people at the Kelsey if you're interested in replicating this work in another community or learning more about how you can support as a donor or a partner or an advocate. So please do reach out since we do this work, as you saw, with a network of thousands of committed folks across the Bay and across the country.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, everyone. We will see you next week.